It's time for another grand experiment, and this time we're testing to see if 360-degree spinning attacks are effective with European swords and swordsmanship. For this experiment, we're specifically looking at swords from European countries. We're not looking at things from East Asian countries, from African countries, or any other areas, just the European countries. And the reason we're doing that is because, well, we want to keep the scope of this experiment small so that we can make meaningful conclusions. The broader the scope, the harder it is to make meaningful conclusions. And honestly, I'm not an expert in those forms of martial arts, so we're going to stick with the ones that I know the most about. So we're going to be focusing on swords from Europe, not polearms, not spears, not things like that. So long swords, messers, sabers, and other such items. We're also limiting the scope of the experiment by defining the situation it's being used in. So for this experiment, we're looking to see if you can use a spinning attack in a fight. The reason I say that is because when we did the great reverse grip experiment, we always would get comments like, well, what if you get surprised by somebody attacking you and you don't have time, or you can't reach for your sword with your dominant hand, so you have to draw it with your offhand upside down. Some hyper niche situation that was crafted specifically to make this technique work. And the reason I find that to be disingenuous is because that doesn't make this a good technique. It makes it the only option. Now, if my options are to die or to do a bad technique, I will do that bad technique and try and get back to the spot where I can use the proper technique. So we're taking those out of the equation because it's not the experiment we're trying to do. When you think of spinning attacks, what you think of is what you see in Star Wars and Game of Thrones and things like that, where a character spins around to attack someone else. That is what we're testing out. This is a 3-month experiment. Previously, we did a year-long experiment for the Great Reverse Grip experiment, and it was just too much time. I ran out of things to test. Reverse grip wasn't effective, and I kind of knew that within the first 3 months. Now, some might argue that you need to practice a technique for a really long time to make it work, but realistically, if you do any kind of fighting or martial art, you know that it shouldn't take you that long to execute a technique if it's a good technique. If a technique requires years and years and years of practice to make it usable, it's probably not very effective. So we're going to be focusing on seeing if we can get the spinning attack to work within a 3-month window, focusing on training it up. And that's more than enough time to get some initial success. If we can't find that initial success, if it's still just completely implausible, we're going to chuck it in the waste bin. I'm going to be approaching this experiment a number of different ways. First, biomechanically. I'm going to see if I can use my knowledge of swordsmanship and movement to make a spinning attack work without any outside input. Just experiment, trial and error, to see what spin works the best and which spins aren't very effective. Then I'm going to move on to looking at popular examples from media. So that's like Star Wars, Game of Thrones, the sword spins you see in the movies to see if they're usable. And last, we're going to look at spinning attacks that we know work from things like montante and from polearms and see if we can adapt them to swordsmanship. So with all that said, please join me on the great spinning experiment.